The air was still and cold, the kind of quiet that made every small sound echo. Snow blanketed the small town like a soft white shroud, and the streets were empty. Houses glowed with warm Christmas lights, but their beauty couldn't hide the eerie silence that hung over the night. It was Christmas Eve, and while most families were celebrating together, Emma and her younger brother, Tommy, were alone at home. Their parents had gone to a Christmas party, leaving Emma in charge. Tommy tugged at Emma's sweater, his bright blue eyes wide with excitement. "Let's go outside and make snow angels," he said, his voice breaking the silence in the living room. Emma hesitated. She was 16 and didn't share her brother's fascination with playing in the snow. The thought of stepping into the freezing night didn't appeal to her, but Tommy's hopeful grin made her sigh and grab her coat. "Fine, just for a little while," she said, pulling her scarf tight around her neck. The cold hit them like a wall as they stepped into the yard. Tommy laughed and flopped onto the untouched snow, spreading his arms and legs to create an angel. Emma stood back, watching him with a small smile. It was peaceful, the kind of moment she might have enjoyed if it weren't for the strange feeling creeping up her spine. The night felt wrong. "Emma, look!" Tommy's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was pointing to the edge of the yard, where the snow met the dark line of the forest. There, carved into the frost-covered ground, were strange symbols. They looked ancient, their sharp lines and spirals glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Don't touch them," Emma said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. Tommy tilted his head. "Why not? They're just drawings." "They're not drawings," she said firmly, pulling him away. "Let's go inside. It's too cold out here." Tommy pouted but didn't argue. As they turned back toward the house, Emma glanced over her shoulder. The snow angels Tommy had made looked strange. Their shapes seemed deeper, more defined, like they were pressing into the snow instead of lying flat. She shook her head and hurried inside, locking the door behind them. The warm glow of the living room felt comforting at first, but as Emma sat on the couch, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Tommy was already distracted, playing with his toy cars on the floor, but Emma's eyes kept drifting to the window. The snow angels were still there, faintly visible under the porch light. Then one of them moved. It was subtle, just a shift in the snow, but it made Emma's heart race. She blinked, telling herself it was the wind. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The yard was still, the air too calm for the snow to drift like that. She stood up, her breath catching in her throat. "Emma, are you okay?" Tommy asked, looking up from his toys. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Something was wrong with those snow angels, and as the night stretched on, the uneasy feeling in her chest grew heavier. It was only the beginning. Later that evening, Emma tucked Tommy into bed. He had been talking about the snow angels nonstop, calling them the best ones he'd ever made. She didn't have the heart to tell him that she wished he had never made them at all. As she kissed him goodnight, he whispered, "Do you think snow angels ever wake up?" Emma froze for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Tommy shrugged and smiled sleepily. "I think they'd be nice. Maybe they'd fly around and play with us." Emma forced a chuckle. "Go to sleep, Tommy." But as she left his room and turned off the lights, his words stuck with her. Snow angels waking up? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She tried to shake it off, but something about the night felt heavy. Like the silence wasn't just silence, it was waiting. Downstairs, she curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone to distract herself. The glow of the Christmas tree lights cast a warm, flickering pattern across the walls, but even that couldn't soothe her nerves. She kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something outside. And then she did. It was subtle at first, just a faint movement in the yard. Emma squinted, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But as she stared, her breath hitched. The snow angels were changing. Their outlines were no longer flat impressions in the snow. They were rising, their edges sharp and defined, like they were carving themselves out of the ground. Emma's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. Outside, the snow angels were now standing, their hollow forms glowing faintly under the moonlight. They didn't have faces, but their heads tilted toward the house as if they were watching her. She locked the door, double-checking the deadbolt and drawing the curtains over the window. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone to call her parents, but there was no signal. She paced the room, her mind racing. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. A sudden thud echoed from the back door, followed by the sound of crunching snow. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. Another thud, louder this time, made the door rattle on its hinges. She grabbed a fireplace poker and edged toward the door, her hands clammy and trembling. The noise stopped. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing. She peered through the peephole, but there was nothing there, just the empty, snow-covered yard. "Emma!" She whipped around. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear as day. It came from Tommy's room. Her blood turned to ice as she ran up the stairs, throwing open Tommy's door. He was sitting up in bed, staring out the window. "Tommy, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They're here," he said, pointing to the window. Emma's heart dropped. She stepped closer, dreading what she might see. Outside, the snow angels were lined up against the house, their hollow forms pressed against the glass. One of them raised an arm, its icy fingers scratching slowly down the window. "Get away from the window!" Emma yelled, pulling Tommy back. She grabbed his hand and bolted for the attic, slamming the door behind them. Her mind raced. What were those things, and how had they come to life? As Tommy clung to her, crying softly, she realized that the snow angels weren't just random shapes in the snow. They were something else, something old, something evil, and they weren't going to stop. The attic was cold, far colder than it should have been. Emma could see her breath in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. She clutched Tommy tightly, her heart pounding as she pressed her ear to the door. At first, there was silence, but soon the sound of slow, deliberate scratching reached her ears. "They're trying to get in," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tommy buried his face in her shoulder, too frightened to speak. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like claws raking against the wood. Emma's mind raced. What were those things? Why were they after them? She glanced around the attic, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on an old trunk tucked in the corner. It belonged to their grandmother, a woman who had always been strangely superstitious about the winter season. Emma remembered how she used to warn them, "Never disrespect the snow. It holds secrets we can't understand." She dragged the trunk into the center of the room and threw it open. Inside were yellowed papers, strange trinkets, and a small pendant on a leather cord. The pendant glowed faintly, its surface etched with the same strange symbols Tommy had found outside. "What is this?" she muttered, picking it up. "It's Grandma's," Tommy said softly, his voice shaking. "She said it protects us." Before Emma could respond, a loud crash shook the attic door. The scratching stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant creak as the door began to splinter. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, and the faint sound of wind howling filled the room. Then the door burst open. The snow angels poured in, their hollow forms twisting unnaturally as they moved. Their bodies shimmered with frost, and their eyeless faces seemed to focus directly on Emma and Tommy. One of them stretched an arm toward them, its icy fingers creaking like branches. Emma clutched the pendant tightly, holding it out like a shield. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. To her shock, the snow angels hesitated. The glowing pendant seemed to repel them, but only for a moment. One of the figures let out a low, guttural sound, like wind whistling through a hollow tree, and the others pressed forward, undeterred. "Tommy, get behind me," Emma shouted, her mind racing. She backed up against the far wall, holding the pendant high. The symbols on its surface began to glow brighter, and the snow angels recoiled slightly, their forms flickering, but the glow wasn't strong enough. One of the figures lunged forward, its icy fingers brushing against Emma's arm. She cried out as a searing cold burned her skin, spreading like frostbite. "Run!" she screamed, shoving Tommy toward the attic window. "But where will we go?" he cried, tears streaming down his face. "Just go!" she yelled, shoving the window open. The cold air rushed in, but it was better than staying. Tommy scrambled onto the roof, and Emma followed, clutching the pendant. Below them, the snow angels were gathering, their forms blending into the snowdrifts. It was as if the entire yard had come alive, the snow shifting and writhing like a living thing. "Emma? They're everywhere," Tommy sobbed, clinging to the roof's edge. She held him close, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The pendant glowed brighter now, pulsing with heat, but she knew it wouldn't last. The snow angels were too many, too strong. One of the figures climbed onto the roof, its icy body creaking with every movement. Emma raised the pendant again, but it flickered, the light fading. The snow angel stretched out its arms, and Emma realized, with a sinking feeling, that there was no escape. "Tommy," she said quietly, her voice shaking, "close your eyes." "No, I don't want to," he cried, clinging to her. "Close them," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. As Tommy obeyed, Emma clutched the pendant tightly, whispering a desperate prayer. The snow angel reached for her, its hollow form looming above them. The last thing Emma saw before the world went white was the faint glow of the pendant, flickering one last time before going dark. The wind howled, and then silence. The next morning, the townspeople found the house buried in snow, its windows frosted over. In the yard were two new snow angels, their outlines eerily lifelike. And in the stillness of the morning air, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the faint sound of laughter, soft, cold, and hollow. The yard was silent, the snow a perfect, undisturbed white. Inside the house, time seemed frozen. But on the roof, Emma and Tommy still clung to the edge, their breath coming in icy puffs as the snow angels closed in around them. Emma's hands were trembling, the pendant now cold and lifeless in her grip. She stared at the glowing figures moving closer, their hollow faces unreadable yet filled with a cruel intent. The roof creaked under their weight, frost spreading across the tiles with every step they took. Tommy sobbed quietly beside her. "Emma, I don't want to die," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You're not going to," she said, though her own voice faltered. She didn't believe her words, not really. The snow angels were relentless, their presence like a living storm, suffocating and cold. The first of the creatures reached them, its long, frost-bitten fingers reaching out. Emma swung the pendant wildly, but the glow that had once protected them was gone. The snow angel's icy touch grazed her arm again, and pain shot through her like fire and ice combined. The sky above seemed to darken, the snow falling heavier, blurring the edges of the world. Emma knew there was no help coming. There was no escape. The realization hit her like a weight in her chest. She turned to Tommy, her heart breaking. "You have to jump," she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. Tommy's eyes widened in terror. "No, I won't leave you. You have to," she insisted, gripping his shoulders. "You're smaller, faster. You can make it to the forest. Hide there. They want me, not you." "That's not true," Tommy cried, his voice cracking. "Tommy, please," Emma begged, her voice softened, the desperation clear. "You have to try, for me. I'll distract them. You run." Before Tommy could protest again, Emma shoved him toward the edge of the roof. He hesitated for only a moment before jumping into the snow below. She watched as he stumbled, then began running, his small figure disappearing into the trees. The snow angels didn't follow. Their hollow faces turned back to Emma, their focus unrelenting. She gripped the pendant, her knuckles white. "You want me," she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear and defiance. "Then take me." The snow angels surged forward all at once, their icy forms wrapped around her, their cold touch burning as frost spread over her skin. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the wind. The pendant glowed faintly one last time before it shattered in her hand. As the cold consumed her, Emma's mind filled with flashes of memories, her family, her friends, Tommy's laughter, and then nothing, just the endless white. The townspeople found Tommy wandering near the edge of the woods the next morning, half frozen and delirious. He couldn't explain what had happened, only that his sister was gone. When they returned to the house, they found no trace of Emma. Only a new snow angel stood in the yard, larger and more detailed than the rest, its arms stretched upward as if reaching for the sky. And from that day forward, the townspeople whispered of the cursed snow angels. They warned their children never to make them near the forest, lest they too wake something that should remain buried. But on cold, quiet nights, When the snow falls thick and the wind carries strange whispers, some say they still see her, a figure standing in the snow, her face pale and hollow, watching, waiting for another. Years passed, but the story of Emma and the snow angels became a dark legend in the small town. Parents told their children to never play near the woods on Christmas Eve. "Stay inside," they would say. "The snow angels will come for you if you disturb their rest." For Tommy, the memories never faded. He grew older, but the image of Emma's tearful face and her final scream haunted his dreams. On the surface, he lived a normal life. He graduated, moved to the city, and tried to forget the nightmare that had taken his sister. But deep down, he knew the snow angels weren't just a ghost story. They were real. One winter, years later, Tommy returned to the town for the holidays. His parents had long since moved away, but curiosity, or guilt, drew him back. The house was still there, abandoned and covered in frost, its windows cracked and broken. The yard, though buried in snow, was eerily untouched, as if no one dared to step foot there. Tommy stood at the edge of the property, staring at the spot where he had last seen Emma. The snow angel that resembled her was gone, but the air felt heavy, the silence oppressive. He should have turned back, but something pulled him forward. As he stepped into the yard, the snow seemed to shift beneath his feet. He glanced down and froze. His footprints weren't alone. All around him, faint impressions began to form in the snow, shapes with outstretched arms and hollow heads. They surrounded him, circling closer with every breath. Tommy's heart raced. He turned to run, but the snow angels were faster. They rose from the ground, their forms shimmering in the moonlight, their eyeless faces locked on him. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling. One of the snow angels stepped forward. Its shape was familiar, the outline of its head and shoulders unmistakable. Tommy's chest tightened as it reached out a hand. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen, the weight of the years and the memory of his sister holding him in place. The snow angel leaned closer, its icy breath cold against his skin. And then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The snow surged around him, pulling him down like quicksand. He clawed at the ground, his screams muffled by the cold, suffocating silence. As the snow angels closed in, the last thing Tommy saw was the hollow face of the angel that looked like Emma. The next morning, the yard was pristine, untouched. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just the snow, soft and unbroken. But in the center of the yard stood two snow angels side by side, their forms eerily lifelike. And in the quiet of the snowy morning, if you listened closely, you could hear the faint sound of laughter, soft, cold, and hollow, echoing through the air. The legend of the snow angels had claimed another victim, and it would wait for more.